Welcome. I'm Terry Price, co-director of the Gary L. McDowell Institute, along with my colleague Dan Palazzolo. The Institute is housed in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, but we are a campus home for free inquiry, thoughtful deliberation, and rigorous discussion for students and faculty at the University of Richmond. In support of this mission, the Institute hosts a robust student fellows program with representatives from all three undergraduate schools. Earlier today, the fellows had two discussion sessions with our guest, focusing on his piece, Bury the Words Are Violence Cliché. We have almost 60 student fellows this year, many of whom are with us today. I'd like to ask them, as well as their faculty discussion leaders, Professors Kevin Cherry and Lydia Roddy, both from the School of Arts and Sciences, Eric Kraft from the Robbins School of Business, and Jessica Flanagan from the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, to please stand to be recognized. At the Institute, we're very fortunate to have the support of the Dean and staff of the Jepson School, especially Heidi Thompson there in the back.
Woo!
She coordinated all of today's events, so let's please thank her and the security team and the catering staff taking care of us at the reception to follow this evening's program. Finally, I want to recognize the Paul Lee Family Foundation and the Endeavor Legacy Foundation for making our Student Fellows program and this public lecture series possible. And now to this evening's event, a conversation with Greg Lukianoff. Leading this conversation is Sam Director. Dr. Director is Assistant Professor of Leadership Studies and PPEL, Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law. He earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Whitworth University and his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Director held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University, and before we convinced him to move to the Jepson School, served as assistant professor of philosophy at Florida Atlantic University. He's published numerous journal articles on issues in applied ethics and political philosophy in prominent outlets such as Bioethics, the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, the Journal of Medical Ethics, the Journal of the American Philosophical Association, and Ethical Theory and Moral Practice. Particularly fitting given tonight's conversation, Dr. Director's article, Social Sanctions, Criticism, and Speech, is coming out soon in the journal Social Theory and Practice. Given the mission of the McDowell Institute, who better to serve as our practitioner in residence than Greg Lukianoff? Mr. Lukianoff is President and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's also an attorney with a Stanford Law degree and a New York Times best-selling author. Mr. Lukianoff is author or co-author of more books than we have time to note. I'll mention only a few. Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. The Canceling of the American Mind. Cancel culture undermines trust and threatens all of us, but there is a solution. And very recently, The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. Mr. Lukianoff spent over an hour today with students in my critical thinking class answering questions based on their reading of Coddling of the American Mind. He's also been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, appeared on CBS Evening News, the Today Show, NPR's Morning Edition, and testified both before the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Over two substantial visits this year, Mr. Lukianoff met with university administrators, faculty, including members of our faculty senate, 3 undergraduate classes, several groups of student fellows. Certainly no fly-by speaker on the college campus circuit. More than one person has said to me that they consider Mr. Lukianoff a personal hero. What we've all experienced over the year, as you will tonight, is someone completely dedicated to advocating and educating for freedom of expression. We couldn't be more grateful for the investment he's made in the University of Richmond and particularly in our students. Please join me in welcoming Greg Lukianoff and Sam Director.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Great. All right, so to start off, my first question is just, what's a kind of concise state of the union about free expression on college campuses?
I thought you were going to say in the world.
Just the small area of the campus, yeah.
I'd say that there is a lot greater awareness of the problem of free speech on college campuses, and there's a lot less free speech at the same time. I would say that for a lot of my career, I was, even though I consider myself a liberal, I've been trying to point out a lot of the threats primarily coming from the left, frankly, on college campuses. But now, for the first time since we've been recording it, the number one threat to free speech on campus is actually coming from government again, kind of like it was back in the 50s. Although actually a lot of the threat in the 50s was donors demanding that professors be fired for having communist sympathies. So I would say that the problems, on campus have not been fixed, but the solution has been pressure from the Trump administration, pressure from local government, from donors, et cetera, to clamp down on student and particularly professor speech. And I've seen an uptick of attempts to get professors fired, on par with how bad it was in, say, 2020 or 2021. So it's ugly out there, and globally it's even worse.
As a kind of a related question, so as Terry mentioned, I was a professor in Florida for 2 years, and I still have copies of the memos as little keepsakes about, you cannot compel students to believe or feel the following ways about race or gender or things like that. I was against that, as I wanted to talk about things in the classroom. But I also understand that those state governments fund the universities, and the federal government in some ways funds research at private universities. So given the Trump administration and the DeSantis administration, in my experience, trying to use that as a lever to prevent faculty speech or student speech, given that they fund the institutions to some extent, do they have any justified role?
Yeah, the frustrating thing, there's so many frustrating things to me about the Trump administration. Like, so many. But not the least of which is, even where I agree with him, and I do believe higher education needs reform. I think that we figured out a way to fund higher ed. Basically, I feel like there was two sensible ways to fund higher ed. One, you could have let the free market work, and then things are controlled by market forces. Or you can massively, or publicly fund it at any level, massively or not, but also make sure that you have safeguards to make sure that price doesn't skyrocket and bureaucratization doesn't skyrocket. Those are the only two sensible choices you have. We chose neither. And therefore ended up in a situation where bureaucratization expense kept on going up, but at the same time, bureaucratization and things that are actually threats to free speech and academic freedom also increased. So I believe passionately in higher education reform, and the Trump administration has decided to completely undermine the legitimacy of that enterprise by going after it in wildly unconstitutional ways from multiple different angles. So, for example, in the campus free speech ranking that we do at FIRE, something I'm very proud of, very rigorous, tons of data that we factor into that ranking, Harvard very much earned its last place ranking out of 250 schools 2 years in a row. And it was fun because at first they thought they could get by just claiming the methodology wasn't any good, which gave me the chance to talk about what the methodology was on major platforms. So bring it. But now we're defending Harvard quite vociferously, because what the Trump administration did was they hung their hat on the major problem in higher education being anti-Semitism. I do actually feel like their best argument for the anti-Semitism argument was Columbia University, but they've settled with Columbia. Probably the second most vulnerable school to losing all of their federal funding was actually Harvard, but there was a much weaker case against Harvard than they had against Columbia. But they decided to tie that to a letter, and this is the mind-blowing thing about how it just seems like amateur hour sometimes over there. They sent a letter to Harvard demanding basically that as a settlement for the Title VI hearing, which is for the Title VI allegations against them, that the government take over a role in deciding curriculum, admissions, who they hire. All of these things that basically means that they were nationalizing effectively Harvard. Then they said that they sent the letter by accident, but were standing by it, which I'm still like, I don't even know. That makes my head hurt. So no, the government under no circumstances can nationalize Harvard. They can take away federal funding if it's shown that they engaged in anti-Semitic discrimination or against racial discrimination in hiring or admissions. That there you actually can lose your federal funding. But they didn't follow any of the due process schools are entitled to. And then they tried to use every lever of federal power against Harvard to make them comply with this unconstitutional demand in the first place. So for example, they tried to ban international students from being able to go just to Harvard. Now this is funny because Trump is at his greatest, highest level of executive power if he were to say, because we're concerned about foreign espionage, particularly from China, and a lot of these schools receive massive amounts of federal money that sometimes is tied to highly sensitive research, that we're going to exercise that power to limit and review people who can attend schools that have lots of money related to, say, the DOD, or I guess it's the DOW now. I'm never going to like that. But instead they said, but we're just applying this to Harvard, which of course created the immediate thing that judges are like, okay, then that's just a pretext. Like it's a transparent pretext. So they tried that. But I almost have sympathy for some of Trump's lawyers because they'll try an attack that might work, and then Trump will get on Truth Social and be like, today my Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit referencing unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination, which has been laughed out of courts forever. That's their actual motive. That's basically the way he puts it. He basically says, because a lot of times in court cases you have to show that the government was acting with an inappropriate motive. But he just comes out and says, that's what we're acting under, and then it gets laughed out of court. So I do have sympathy for the desire to engage in smart reforms of higher ed. The way the Trump administration is going about it is completely illiberal, and we will always oppose it. Also, the way that they're, where I believe they have no role, is trying to influence media. The role that they've taken by saying that they will hold mergers of major news corporations over their heads if they don't play ball with the Trump administration, that's unheard of. That's completely inappropriate. And it's why I now think the FCC should be abolished.
That was already clear.
Yeah.
So as a follow-up question, do you think universities are partially to blame for the backlash? And in what ways?
I think higher education is a huge American industry that doesn't like to recognize that it's an almost $1 trillion industry. Because they don't recognize that it acts oftentimes like a $1 trillion industry. It's got interest groups, it's got trade unions that want to say there's nothing wrong here, this is nobody on campus's fault, it's just an evil conspiracy against us. But by the time you're actually trying to say with a straight face that for some of these schools you have to pay $90,000 a year to attend, when the average American family makes something like $60,000 a year, something has gone wrong, and you've been out of touch for a long time once that's happened. So even just on cost and bureaucratization alone, a lot of American higher education is, that's going to spawn resentment at a deep, deep level. Now, of course, then people will inform me that, but kids don't pay the sticker price, they get a discount. And I'm like, do tell. Because I was one of those students. I got a free ride, or so I thought, to American University. And I was like, great, I guess I'll go here because this is the only place I visited. And then American, even though I was one of their top students, kept on stripping away. They kept on chipping away at my free ride. for no reason, just because they thought they could and they had me. Until I wrote about them baiting and switching me. I was also a student journalist. And then they gave me all my money back in my senior year. Weird coincidence there, after I wrote about it my junior year. And what's funny about this is that, well, people will say, it's like, oh, the sticker price doesn't matter. It's like, no, there's research on this. This discourages lower income kids like I was from attending these schools in the first place because they believe something like what happened to me would happen to them. And it did happen to me, so I can't really reassure them. So I think just on cost and bureaucratization alone, higher education lost the trust of the people. However, when you add it to the fact that on every single hot button issue in the United States today, I have seen a professor or students, usually both, get in trouble for making an argument on the wrong side of that, that destroys public trust. I mean, I give the example of Carol Hooven, who faced a cancel campaign and ultimately left Harvard because she argued that biological sex is real and it's bimodal. She is an evolutionary biologist. And when the public sees someone forced out at Harvard for saying that, they're never going to trust you on that topic again, or possibly any other, and that's if it only happens once. I wrote a whole book, Canceling of the American Mind, on how deep the cancellation attempts went. You're talking about 1 in 6 professors saying they were either threatened with punishment or actually punished for their speech, research, or pedagogy. That has no parallel in American history. Not the Red Scare. About 9% of professors in the social sciences said that they were toning down what they wrote at the height of the Red Scare. That's really bad, by the way. 10% of them people saying they're toning it down. 1 in 6 saying they were actually threatened with punishment or punished has no parallel. So I do think higher education got itself into this to a very large degree. At the same time, this is normal when massive industries grow at a high rate for a very long period of time. You have institutional decay, you have some amount of corruption introduced, all this kind of stuff. But it's not helping when major institutions within higher education are saying, I read this recent thing from the American Association of University Professors, where they're even saying, well, it's not even proven that there's a leftward tilt in higher ed. And I'm like, every single study that has ever come out has said it's an overwhelming leftward tilt. And the idea that they're saying that we don't even know that, it's like, really? You can't even admit that's a problem? So I do think higher education has not done itself a lot of favors, and I've been very encouraged by a lot of university presidents taking seriously that there are problems they need to fix. I've been very encouraged by professors in some departments taking very seriously problems in higher education. I have been very frustrated by some professors in some departments in particular that they really just want to be left alone and to continue to get a paycheck and change nothing and go further down the direction of a monoculture that they're already on.
So building on that, I wonder, academics can often be really cowardly and they can often be really courageous.
Yes.
And I wonder, just an example that comes to mind of each in your recent experience at FIRE, and why do you think so many academics who have tenure don't use it in the robust ways that it should protect them?
Yeah, and if you're wondering why I'm not looking at him when I talk, it's because if I face him, you can't hear me as well, so I'm not just being rude. I'm being rude with a purpose. So yeah, I would say that one of the great disappointments of my career, and I came in pretty pro-tenure. I came in being like, listen, I'm persuaded by the argument that professors to do fearless research, they need this protection from being fired for doing that fearless research. And tenure sounds like it makes sense. But unfortunately, I have seen the overwhelming majority of tenured professors not take the safest job in the world and use it to defend even their fellow professors when they get in trouble, or defend other students. So it was supposed to produce courage. I think it's actually produced conformity. I think it's actually been part of like a conformity engine where essentially people started seeing a job in academia as if you get tenure, then you're set for life as being the primary goal, that you can do this job for the rest of your career, as opposed to it's supposed to make you courageous, not desperate to keep your sweet gig. I have seen many tenured professors, however, when the conservatives kind of like make the argument for getting rid of it, I'm like, listen, you should know that a lot of the remaining conservative professors who are courageous, and a lot of the remaining, left liberal professors who are standing up for colleagues all over the spectrum are tenured. And they are using that protection to be courageous and to defend people they disagree with in many cases. So you might actually, if you get rid of it, be cutting out your own cutting off your own legs. So when I think of like professors who have been courageous, I think of Robbie George at Princeton. I think of the FIRE co-founder Alan Charles Kors. He used his tenure to defend professors and students' academic freedom, even if he totally disagreed with them, and I find that very admirable. But in terms of professors who I think have shown none of that, I've watched actual professors who rely on tenure say they defend tenure, but we should be decreasing the number of things that are protected by academic freedom, and just coincidentally, the new exception to academic freedom will eliminate every person to my right who is currently on campus. So I do think that's part of this problem of not admitting that there's a problem in higher education at all today, and saying basically we have no interest in reforming.
How much of that do you think is that, just to use the Florida example one more time, at the time tenure was protected by the collective bargaining agreement, and DeSantis passed a law that made it so if higher ed unions didn't reach 60% density, which was like impossible, that they would be disbanded, and if the union was disbanded, the CBA was disbanded, which was effectively what backed tenure. So it was kind of a workaround.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just one example, but how much of the time do you think it's, speaking for myself, I think if they wanted to fire me for something, they would find a way.
Yeah, and one way to be fair about people not being as emboldened from tenure is it's particularly galling that people weren't emboldened by tenure more like 15 years ago. I'd say in the last 10 years, it hasn't been that great of a protection. It definitely, when you look at the data though for professors getting fired, there are definitely fewer professors getting fired who are tenured. So basically like the way we do the Scholars Under Fire database is we follow attempts to get professors fired, and then we figure out who was more likely to actually get punished or fired. So we have about 1,600, 1,700 examples of professors, attempts against professors to be fired. Unfortunately, an awful lot of those come from students, which was a new thing as of 2017, at least in the numbers that we're seeing. And if you look at the chart for that, it's horrifying. It's basically like it's not really a thing, and then 2017, it's like through the roof. Students joining petitions to get their professors fired. I always stress that is not normal historically. That is something that is normal in totalitarian countries, but not in the United States generally. And people are like, what about the 60s? I'm like, they weren't actually generally signing petitions to get their professors fired for beliefs. They were oftentimes they were part of the free speech movement, quite to the contrary. But when it comes to professors who are actually punished, tenured professors weren't that much better insulated from being punished. They were still punished. About 2/3 of professors who are targeted are punished in some way. When it comes to fired, tenured professors were less likely to be fired. But still, of the hundreds of professors I've seen fired, dozens of them were tenured professors who were fired for speech, which used to be, earlier in my career, thought to be and appeared to actually be essentially near impossible. So tenure does not provide quite the same level of protection as it used to as well.
Was there a difference in those cases between public and private institutions?
Generally, you're better protected at public colleges because they're bound by the First Amendment than you are at private colleges. Private colleges are just held to their contractual promises, unless, of course, they're in the state of California, because there's something called the Leonard Law that actually applies First Amendment standards to non-sectarian public colleges. It was actually passed specifically for my alma mater, Stanford, to make sure that they couldn't adopt a speech code in the 1990s. But generally, schools are just held, private schools are just held to their own promises of freedom of speech.
At my alma mater in graduate school, there was a center that had a visiting chair in conservative thought. I'm curious, and they've done it maybe for a decade now.
Yeah.
And there were misses and there were hits. Like one year it was forget his name, the guy who was in the background photos of January 6th.
Oh, God.
And he's a Chapman Law professor, and he was like...
Oh, John Eastman?
Yes.
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
So there were some misses.
Yeah.
But what do you think of the idea of essentially affirmative action positions for conservatives?
I think the defense of affirmative action, where it was found to be the most persuasive by the courts, was that it was an increase in viewpoint diversity among the professorate. That was essentially the argument that the Supreme Court bought in the Bakke decision, when they said that universities can decide to increase diversity as a proxy to increase viewpoint diversity. That was the primary argument defending it. They thought this was so important, they were willing to suspend the 14th Amendment presumption that you can never discriminate on the basis of race. And they were like, listen, we're going to suspend this for this special case because increasing viewpoint diversity, if they want to, is that important. Over time, though, and to be clear, most schools were not in line with Bakke. There was another court case. They were discriminating well beyond what you were allowed to do. So, for example, Bakke says you can't have racial quotas in higher ed. Then a lot of schools clearly continued to have racial quotas, particularly with regard to Asian American students. There are a number of schools that if you look them up, you'll find conspicuously they've always had about 20% Asian American students year after year, almost exactly. And it's like, that's kind of suspicious. And so there was another case called Gratz and another case called Grutter around 2000, in the early 2000s. And those cases got a little bit more specific about what affirmative action did and didn't mean. They leaned a little less on the diversity rationale, but basically said stare decisis, which basically means we have to do what we did before. So yeah, this is still okay. Even though in previous cases, the Supreme Court had said that we thought this was something that should only last basically about 20 years, like something or a generation, to kind of make up for past discrimination, particularly against African Americans. It was no surprise that by the time you got to Students for Fair Admissions that they decided to overturn the older holdings to say, listen, this we tried this experiment more or less. We think it's time to end it. You're no longer allowed to use race as a consideration in admissions. You can go about this other ways. But I do actually think that nothing's been done to the idea that you can't actually try to increase the viewpoint diversity of your professorate or your student body. In fact, it's a good idea. You just can't use race as a proxy for that anymore. And when it comes to like how you could actually do that, since a lot of these departments I've definitely lost my faith and trust as you can tell, in a lot of these departments. And I think that they, left to their own devices, they replicated the culture of their departments and got people who thought a lot like them over time. And I don't really trust them to want to fix this themselves. So I don't want politicians fixing this either. Some of the ideas I have heard for one potential way to fix it is to have a university presidents or some administrators with the power to basically say, listen, my economics department doesn't have any dissenters in it. It would be healthier if it did. I'm appointing 2 more people. They don't have to be conservatives, but they just have to disagree with the rest of the department to that department. Daniel Diermeyer at Vanderbilt had an idea of actually having counter departments, that basically if you're going to have a politically uniform sociology department, then maybe you have a completely independent department of quantitative sociology, just by actually, mostly of critics of a lot of the distortions in that field. I think these are all ways to use what I call in the next book I'm working on, called The Neuroscience of Knowing, structured friction as a way to kick the tires to improve the integrity of knowledge itself. We need to have more disagreement, and we need to have more testing. We need to have more structured friction, and that can come from outside institutions, that can come from private clubs, that can come from universities who actually, one of the things I'm proposing in the book with my co-author is something called Replication University that's entirely exists just to test how sound our existing knowledge is. There's lots of ways to achieve this, but I do think that it isn't sustainable to keep on having a version of higher education where there's just less and less and less political diversity over time.
What do you think about the recent centers like the Chase Center at Ohio State and the Civitas Center at UT Austin that are ostensibly conservative state legislatures have given a large amount of money to hire tenure track lines? So I know at Ohio State, because a friend of mine just got one of these jobs, they got a huge amount of money for like, it's usually under the heading of Western Civ, leadership, and it kind of codes conservative. And at least in that case, I know the faculty was against it.
Yeah.
Do you think that these, and they often have their own majors that kind of overlap, like the one at UT Austin has a PPE major, but there's already a philosophy major at UT Austin, and they offer some of the same courses, so it's kind of like competition. Do you think those are positive? Do you have any view about that?
I mean, I think it depends. Do I think state schools and state institutions can set up things like that? Constitutionally, yeah, I think they can. I also, something that I've gotten much more pessimistic about over 24 years of doing this is, and this will anger some people in the room, it's faculty governance. I have been bitterly disappointed by the behavior of some faculty governance and the way it actually behaves towards the free speech rights of their students or even of their own members if they don't like the politics of those professors. And so I do think that you need some contrast there. And so I think that essentially if you have a center, if you've reached the point that the only way you're actually going to have any political disagreement whatsoever is to have it imposed from outside, you've probably brought that on yourself. But does that mean that these centers are necessarily any good? It honestly depends on who the scholars they get and like how they're maintained. I tend to think a lot of these centers, by the way, will also be captured. That essentially, if they do fall under the hands of some of these administrators, they will actually, I mean, okay, there was something that happened in California. I just wish I could remember the school. So the issue of anti-Semitism in higher ed has been something that's been around for a long time, and I do think it's a problem, to be clear. I think that in elite higher education and in practically all of California, I think there's this kind of like reflexive, and I'm not Jewish, but this reflexive kind of anti-Israel kind of sentiment that is almost like boringly predictable. I think it's a real thing, but I remember when some donors wanted to address that in some of the state schools of California, they created an anti-Semitism ombudsman for a particular campus. And guess who faculty appointed as the anti-Semitism ombudsman? Probably the most anti-Israel professor at that particular school. And we were like, told you, like this is going to be captured. You can't just wave a wand and expect different results. So I do think that I think that some of these centers could be positive. I think Robbie George's center at Princeton has been a positive influence on that campus. I think what is the name of the center at Brown?
So when I was there, it was the Political Theory Project, and now it's the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics.
Oh, okay, but it had a weird name.
The John Tomasi one?
Yeah, the John Tomasi one.
Yeah, it was Political Theory Project.
But it had a specific reference. Anyway, but I think that's been a positive reference too. But it does really depend on the people you get. But I do think it's sad that if the only way you can create some amount of political contrast is create new centers that have to be imposed on higher ed. And I don't think it's sad, that politicians are necessarily doing that. I feel like that they actually have a decent rationale for why they need to.
Fire is in a weird position where it seems like every time an administration changes, people decide they're for or against fire. I can think, of times where fire's been canceled simultaneously from the left and the right.
You mean like this morning?
What was the case you have in mind?
I just mean it just seems like every day, and I'm used to it.
Yeah. Does it? And it, everyone loves free speech when you ask them about it. Like everyone thinks free speech is great.
Yes, Erdogan loves free speech apparently.
So, why do you think that is? That people are fair weather friends to organizations like FIRE, and what's the kind of challenge of being a genuinely principled organization in a time where the people who are your allies today will probably be wanting to get rid of you in 4 years.
I mean, honestly, like I feel very lucky that I'm very used to this, and it can be exhausting, but at the same time, I mean, I started at Fire right after 9/11, and so my first cases were defending people who said unpopular and often deeply insensitive things about 9/11. So this included, my very first letter was defending someone who said, during the attacks, anyone who can blow up the Pentagon has my vote. Now, this is a professor at University of New Mexico known for this kind of sense of humor, and he was joking. And he apologized for it, the whole thing. But we defended him, and actually he wasn't willing to defend himself. And I got a letter from him. He wrote actually an article that summer saying I should have listened to Fire because they did eventually figure out a way to kick me out. And I told him this on the phone. They will figure out a way to get rid of you. And they did. Another case that we defended was defending Sami al-Aryan. Sami al-Aryan was accused of having ties to foreign terrorist organizations, which if you're aiding and abetting foreign terrorist organizations, that's a felony. But they fired him because they found a video of him saying death to Israel in a 1989 speech at something. And, I don't like that. But at the same time, is that protected? Unquestionably. So they decided to fire him for the 1989 video in 2001, not for the allegation that he committed a felony. And why didn't they bring up the felony? It's because they'd done a whitewash of Sami al-Aryan several years before that exonerated him, but it was very badly done. Basically it was just trying to make University of South Florida look good, like there's no question there. So that was my first time on TV, was defending Sami al-Aryan. And boy, do you get death threats and hate mail after that. So I'm used to it. I'm used to people being, so like when people would say that we were conservative, I was just kind of like, oh, for God's sakes, how many left-leaning professors have Fire to thank for actually still having a job? And we've always been like this. And now it's just on a much bigger scale. I will say that the Trump administration, though, since it's such a more comprehensive attack on freedom of speech, it does make it makes it hard to appear to be nonpartisan when you're being overwhelmed with examples of violations of the First Amendment coming from one side. We still have plenty of cases of threats from the left, to be clear, but they are drowned out to a large degree by things that the Trump administration is doing. So there are more people on the right who used to love us who have decided to withdraw their funding, from Fire, which means I've been traveling the country like a crazy person trying to find individuals who get freedom of speech. And that's harder. That's harder work. And we are run ragged at Fire at this point. Like we are killing ourselves out there, both defending freedom of speech, but also trying to, make sure that we can fund it. Now, the spirit within the organization is strong. We rise to these moments. But I do wish there was a larger constituency for free speech for everybody than there is. And I think there used to be a larger constituency for free speech for everybody than there is now.
Do you think in the Trump era, are there particular topics that are more likely to get one canceled? I guess either by the left or the right. Are there particular topics that since Trump was elected have kind of come under fire that weren't beforehand?
Yeah, so I would say that on the left, it was race for a lot of my career. Israel-Palestine was much lower. I think it was like 10th on the things that would get you canceled. Anything related to trans can get you canceled. Those were like two of the big ones. And Israel-Palestine was much lower. Now it's overwhelmingly Israel-Palestine that will get you canceled on campuses, also from the left. When it comes to the Trump administration, so much of Trump is just such a naked exercise of power. So, I mean, like, the extent to which opposing the Trump administration is one of the worst things you can do as far as Trump is concerned. It's just, well, it has the benefit of being very linear, you know? It's like very predictable. So I definitely, he goes after people he sees as his enemies and people who actually do oppose him, and that's very clear. As far as something that led to a huge explosion of attempts on the right to get people punished, it was, and I feel like I should say this first. I didn't agree with Charlie Kirk on any number of things. I had lots of criticisms of him. Him being murdered on campus was a horrible moment for the country. He was someone there to argue with people. I don't care if you don't like what he was arguing. He was there to argue, and that's okay. I actually went back and watched a lot of the videos of him arguing on campus, and I was actually surprised at how patient he often was with students who sometimes didn't actually know what they were talking about in some cases. And he actually showed more patience and poise than I was expecting. I spoke at University of Utah Valley University actually just 2 weeks ago, and it was terrible to be there. But the Trump administration responded by using the death of Charlie Kirk, the murder of Charlie Kirk, to go after anybody who said anything, saying everything from as nasty as that guy had it coming to, well, I really disagreed with that guy while he's alive. Like I just said, by the way, like that I really disagreed with him. And so we saw an absolute explosion of attempts to get professors and everybody else punished for saying things critical of Charlie Kirk after the death of Charlie Kirk. There are ironies abound about this. Charlie actually, one thing that Trump was saying, that Pam Bondi was arguing that this was a hate speech rationale, that people saying nasty things about Charlie Kirk were engaged in hate speech. Charlie Kirk was on the record saying hate speech is protected speech. So many of the things the Trump administration tried in the wake of Charlie Kirk were things that Charlie Kirk himself had specifically rejected. I would say that specifically that has been one of the biggest ones. And then, of course, pro-Palestinian speech as well.
So Fire recently, I don't think I have the wording on this right, it wasn't issued a warning, but there was something where the president of Hillsdale College published an op-ed saying he was upset that Fire had said Hillsdale was wrong to have these kind of civility requirements. Can you just fill us in what was going on there, and what did you think of his response to Fire?
He thinks our rating is unfair, and I believe his characterization of our rating is very unfair. Now, like I said before, if you're a public college, you're bound by the First Amendment. You have no choice. If you're a private college, you can, even if you receive federal funding, you can decide to promise free speech or academic freedom or not. You can actually be a religious college and say, here, first and foremost, we place our Christian identity. And then we also provide academic freedom and free speech, as a lot of schools try to sort of square the circle. Hillsdale does not promise contractually freedom of speech. So we call them a warning school because what we're trying to do is warning people who attend there that if they attend there, they have no contractual free speech rights or First Amendment free speech rights. It's a warning for people to attend there to know that they're going to be out of luck if they get in trouble for something that would be free speech at a public college or even at a college that provided contractual promises of freedom of speech. This is accurate. And Hillsdale has tried to convey that as if we're basically saying that we think we've chastised them by calling them a warning school. And it's like, no, that's not even fairly explaining like what we mean by warning schools. And they keep on like trying to get us to either change the rating or change what we call the rating. And like, no, we think warning school is exactly what we're trying to say. We're not saying you're a bad school. We're saying people going there need to know that they have no free speech rights that are at least in any way that they could legally defend. Now, what's funny about it is one of the reasons why I think Hillsdale is so mad about this is because they know that on a lot of our rankings, they do pretty well. That actually liberal students who attend Hillsdale, surprisingly, actually somewhat surprisingly to me, they do way better than students at other warning schools when it comes to the environment for speech. And like I said, even liberal students at Hillsdale say this. They do way better than Baylor, way better than all of these other schools that also don't, BYU, that also don't promise freedom of speech. So I think they'd like to be highly rated while not promising free speech. But it's like, I'm sorry, like if you don't promise free speech, we can't rank you with the schools that actually do promise it. You just are off the rankings. So I get the argument. I think it's unfair, and I think the way we characterize it is fair.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one more question, then we'll go to student questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that free speech is not necessarily kind of a monolithic idea and there are reasonable disagreements about what constitutes free speech, how at FIRE do you handle internal disagreements where it seems like people are acting in good faith?
I crush it.
Exactly, yeah.
No, it was really nice to. My dad's Russian, so I'm not being offensive by faking a Russian accent. Within FIRE, I am very proud of the job we do disagreeing with each other. I think we do it really well. We try to actually have a organization that has as a priority that we try to have a politically diverse workplace on purpose. FIRE internally leans way more to the left than to the right. And actually, I'm glad that people are concerned about that, even within FIRE, because we want to make sure that we are a politically diverse workplace, because we know that unlike some of these departments or the AUP who think there's nothing wrong, that unless you have someone who's smart and disagrees with you sometimes in the room, you're not going to really understand where your blind spots are. So I think we do a very good job of disagreeing with each other constructively, and when we don't, like that's more when I get like, okay guys, like let's not straw man the other side here. We need to steel man it. We need to figure out like where we might be wrong. And we ultimately disagree less than you'd probably think. We're mostly in line with First Amendment law. I do think that some of the tougher areas are things that actually involve legitimate and serious claims of national security. I do think that that's actually something that First Amendment people struggle with sometimes. And distinctions between children and adults, which is actually something that is being more fleshed out in the law in a way that I predicted, partially because I felt like the First Amendment community hadn't seen that coming in a way that it should have. But I do think that we do a very good job of disagreeing with each other. And when we do disagree, even at the end of the discussion, we try to disagree and commit. To just say, it's like, listen, you don't have to agree with us ultimately on everything, but you're going to agree with us we're going to agree with each other most of the time.
Great. Well, I think now it's time for some student questions. And
I should say, I talked to 3 classrooms of students this morning, and they were just excellent. I thought almost all the questions were just excellent, thoughtful, like really top-notch.
Great. So I think first is Andrew Suela. Did I say that correctly?
And here is one of the students.
Okay. So my question is, do you think there should be any restriction on disrespectful language? For example, being disrespectful in sacred public spaces like a war memorial?
That's a great question. Generally, disrespectful, so if you pass a ban on disrespectful speech, that will rightfully be laughed out of court, because that's what's called viewpoint discrimination. It's like, and John Stuart Mill was dead right on this kind of stuff, that essentially, because what happens due to human psychology, you will see respectful speech that really disagrees with power, or with you, or with the ruling class, or with the people who get to make these decisions. Well, that was disrespectful because you really disagreed with me. That's how we'll feel it. But even deeply disrespectful speech from a side you agree with or power agrees with, you tend to see as righteous rage. So we're not even good at making those kind of distinctions. It's one of the reasons why we have a specific problem with viewpoint discrimination and censorship. However, when it comes to like war memorials or other monuments and that kind of stuff, first of all, you're always allowed time, place, and manner restrictions that are related to what the public area is for. So can you have greater restrictions on, say, I live in Washington, D.C., and I take my 7 and 9-year-old walking down the mall like every weekend, and I freaking love it. And there's like the World War II memorial all the way at the end, and it's a very open space. But generally, like, people are told that like they can wear signs and T-shirts and protest and that kind of stuff, but they have to keep it kind of quiet when they're actually like in part of it because people want to enjoy the monument. And that's okay. That would be considered a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. It has to leave open ample areas for protest. So in the rare situations where people do want to protest at the World War II memorial, they generally don't, because it's not like people are, they're there to see the World War II memorial. They do it on the sidewalk, right by it, or at least outside of the like interior part. Also an interesting thing, and this was something where I thought the First Amendment community was shooting itself in the foot, by the way. There is a smaller Lincoln Memorial that has a dome over it, and the question was whether or not you can have like a dance party there. And I knew First Amendment lawyers who were like, "I'm taking this case," and I'm like, "Really?" Like, because the way it came down was that essentially it was a smaller Jefferson Memorial, sorry, was that that's not even considered a public forum. That's considered a non-public area that essentially doesn't have to be open to protest at all. Like, it's like an indoor covered space, so it didn't even have to be open for dancing or expression of any kind. Like, they actually, it's not considered a public forum. So you can actually protect spaces, as long as you're doing it in a viewpoint neutral way. What would not be allowed, for example, like, is if you had a rule against a rule that you had to be quiet, like close to the Vietnam War memorial, but you didn't enforce it against opinions you liked. The state didn't enforce against opinion they liked, but banned people with opinions they don't like in practice. That would open you up to viewpoint discrimination. But generally, like, the rules around being, being quiet around things that people, come to observe and enjoy is pretty well respected in DC.
Great. All right, Megan?
I know all these people.
So my question is, should universities provide incentives for students who hold minority political opinions to stimulate political debate beyond one-party domination of political discourse?
Incentives? Like, what kind of incentives are you thinking of?
Any incentives to create an environment where they would feel more comfortable expressing their opinions. I'm not really sure what incentives would be best.
Everyone gets a pie.
Yeah, no, like, it could be like material incentives, I guess, that would be an option. Or academic incentives, I'm not really sure.
I don't think it should be incentives. I think probably creating a situation, like, you would think as a constitutional lawyer, I would really just want everything to be debate. But I think there are limitations to debate, and it's one of the reasons why I'm almost more of a social scientist at this point, because I get more excited about some of the stuff in the social sciences. I actually really have come around to what are called listening projects, where essentially the goal is not to change someone's mind, it's to understand where they're coming from deeply. And I think even just providing a forum where someone can talk about, who's from a very different background than a lot of the students at a particular school can be very powerful for creating empathy, for example. And I've seen schools use this for minority students, but I think that using it for just students who are from just genuinely different backgrounds can be very empowering, and I think it can actually be really quite beautiful. And I had an experience actually of this one time. It wasn't exactly like an incentive moment, but like something that you could facilitate in a situation where the goal was to listen to someone's perspective. It was me failing as a moderator at the Root Strikers conference in Nashville, Tennessee, many years ago. And it was not too long after the election of Trump. I had like a panel that had one guy from Kentucky and a couple of preachers and some activists on stage, and I was supposed to facilitate a conversation with them. And I did a terrible job. And the preacher really preached about like how he couldn't be friends with anybody who was a Republican because they voted for Trump, and like he really got into it, and then he was getting all sorts of like agreement from the rest of the panel, except for the guy from Kentucky. And finally, when I did my job and brought this guy into the conversation, he took a long pause, and he was an older fellow. And he said, listen, I understand all your criticism of Trump. I'm not a fan of the man myself, but this is what you got to understand about some of the people who voted for him. I'm from a small town in Kentucky. We had 1,200 mining jobs up until about 5 years ago. We have 300 now. And the whole room went, oh. Like, you can have powerful moments like that when just your goal is to understand where someone is coming from. So I think, honestly, if you were to give some of those students a platform with, with kind of like the idea of the school itself saying, like, listen, these guys might challenge some of your views on some stuff, but hear them out. I think that could be powerful, and I think there are a lot of students who would be happy to have that, and to realize that that the campus itself wants you to get to know each other at a deeper level.
And then I think we have time for one more. So Alexa.
I remember Alexa.
In your book, The Coddling the American Mind, you talk a lot about safetyism, and I was wondering what you think the best way for universities to fight the negative impacts of safetyism would be without students thinking that the university no longer cares about their well-being.
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, it's one of the things that I said at the end of Coddling that I've only come to believe more, is that one of the things that could help the most with sort of like the safetiest expectation would be if students as a normal matter took more time between high school and college not studying. That essentially, like, if they worked a job or had something that developed a sense of an internal locus of control and a sense of self-efficacy, you'd have less demands for other people to make you feel safe. Because a lot of what the sort of safetiest kind of expectation comes from is a very sort of cloistered, sheltered kind of expectation that college will be just like high school. And I think if people had more engagement with things that made them feel more capable, more competent, more independent, that they would want that a lot less. So I do actually think that there's a lot, and I've noticed this time and time again, like when we have plaintiffs in lawsuits, oftentimes they're non-traditionally aged students because they're not putting up with being told what they can't say. So when it comes to being compassionate, I do actually think that there's plenty of ways you can show compassion, but it can't just be by the rule that everybody else has to change their behavior, assuming that everybody is the most vulnerable student in the room. There has to be some amount of recognition that if students really are suffering that badly, what they need is help, with mental health services, with all of these other potential services. But they do have to have some expectation at the very beginning that we're here to help you, and if you're struggling, we want to know. But ultimately, if you want to be safe from ideas, this is not the right place. This is not, we're not going to do that ultimately. We can prepare you for those ideas, but we can't protect you from them. That's what this whole experiment is for. So I do think creating different expectations, having older students, making sure that you're not placing everybody else in the position of making sure that everybody's not sensitive to everything. I think we tried that experiment over the last 15 years, and I don't think it worked. So, but I do think there's lots of ways you can show compassion and genuine compassion. I mean, I'm the author of Coddling the American Mind, a book whose title I hate, by the way. I wanted to call it Disempowered, and FIRE is a demanding place to work. When I have employees who are struggling, we are the most compassionate organization you could possibly work at. We are like, we want to help you, we want to make sure you're okay, come to us, and all of my employees know that about our culture. You really can have both.
Good evening. I'm Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my pleasure to invite you to thank SAM Director and Greg Lukianoff for this wonderful conversation. I'm grateful for the courageous work that Greg and his colleagues do. I began my career in economics with the study of the transition to modern economics in the late 19th century. At that time, we took for granted John Stuart Mill's position, whom Greg referenced, about the benefits of free discussion, perhaps too much for granted, for as Mill famously wrote in 1859, we have a fatal tendency, as he called it, to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful, a tendency that is a cause of half our errors. Today, Mill's admonitions have come under fire, and there are no guarantees that we or our students will be able to speak and discuss ideas cordially and without fear of repercussion. The work that Greg does is one bulwark against those who would silence speech. So too, our purpose at the McDowell Institute is to encourage our students, many of whom are here this evening, to know the whole of a subject, as Mill wrote, to hear what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and study all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. By all accounts, we're making a difference at the McDowell Institute. Our students are our best ambassadors in this regard, and they tell us that we're making a difference. As Terry Price noted at the outset of this talk, the McDowell Institute has been very generously supported by grants from the Pauley family and the Endeavor Legacy Foundations. We're now also raising endowment funding for the Institute so that its programming can continue long into the future. If you're interested in contributing, please follow up with me. You can email me at speart, S-P-E-A-R-T, at richmond.edu, or scan the QR code on the screen or our website and select the Gary L. McDowell Institute endowment option. Thank you again, and now let's adjourn to a reception in the Fincham lobby and a book signing. Thank you, Greg Lukianoff.